Chapter 11. From time to time, Sister Mary Angela called a group of boys from the same class into her office for refreshments and a report on their school activities. She taught only music classes, but as director of the school, she liked to keep in touch with the boys. It was an hour everybody in Georgie's class enjoyed. "We like bragging to Sister about how smart we are," Timothy told Georgie when the first meeting of the year was called. "And at the same time having all the cracker and peanut butter sandwiches we want in the middle of the afternoon." Sister Mary Angela listened attentively to everything they had to tell her that afternoon. Timothy had a science experiment going, running white rats in a maze he had built himself, rewarding them for making a correct turn with the sound of musical chimes, punishing them for wrong turns with a clash of cymbals. Then I'll compare their learning time with another group rewarded with food and punished with no food. I predict the food-rewarded ones will do best. I know I would," he added, accepting his fifth sandwich and grinning at Sister Mary Angela. Richie had read an article on power conservation and reported on it in some detail. Tom Wilcox told about a recent field trip to an orange grove and a talk with the orchardist. Kevin had written some poetry, which he handed to Sister, asking if she would please read it in private and talk to him about it later. Georgie sat quietly listening and saying nothing. After a while, quite out of the blue, Sister asked, "Now, what about books? What have you boys been reading lately?" Timothy immediately pointed to Georgie. "Ask him, Sister. He's the one with his nose in a book half of the time." She turned to Georgie, smiling. "All right, then, let's hear from the book lover. What books have you liked best lately, Georgie?" Her words took him back painfully to another classroom. "What do you like best?" Miss Cressman had asked. He had been afraid to answer at first, but finally he said, "I like flowers." And then he felt hot and ashamed. The kids had giggled when they saw that Georgie was ashamed, and he could still feel the lonesomeness of that moment. But things were different now. These kids were his friends, especially Timothy, and Sister Mary Angela's smile was like her, gentle and nice. Still, the memories that hurt him were too sharp for him to speak. They made his face grow hot and his throat begin to tighten. "Won't you name just a few of them, Georgie? I'd like to know if there are some I've missed and maybe have a treat coming." Georgie took a deep breath then and looked at her. "Well, I liked the Moon Singer and all the fairy tales, especially the Ugly Duckling. And then I liked the Miraculous Pitcher and Bambi. I wanted to read Treasure Island, but it's a little too hard for me." He paused and then added hurriedly, "Oh, yes, another one, a real old one that Mr. Collier found for me. It's called A Dog of Flanders." Sister Mary Angela leaned forward. "Oh, Georgie, I read that book when I was a little girl, and I cried so hard. My father was upset and told the teacher that I should have only cheerful books to read until I was older. I guess he didn't know that I liked to cry over certain books." He nodded to her with a message in his eyes. He wanted to tell her that he too had cried over Nello and Patrice when he was alone in his room. When the meeting was about over, Sister spoke to them about her choir. "I'm in need of some treble voices," she told them. "My choir boys grow up before I know it. Most of the treble voices in the choir are changing so fast from high to low that we are getting top-heavy with deep voices." She glanced around the group. "Anybody care to come up to the organ loft tomorrow after classes and try out?" Richie and Timothy raised their hands immediately, and several of the other boys followed their lead. Kevin shook his head. "Not me, Sister. I can't keep a tune going right to save my neck." Georgie didn't raise his hand, but in answer to her questioning look, he said, "I don't know if I could do it. I'd like to if I thought I could learn." "Come up with Timothy tomorrow, and we'll find out whether I think you can learn or not." She passed the last sandwiches around and shooed the boys out of her office. The next afternoon, Timothy and Georgie were the first two ready for the tryouts. Sister Mary Angela made a little running tune on the organ and asked Timothy to repeat it with the syllables she gave him. "Pretty good, Tim," she commented. Come in for practice tomorrow afternoon." When it was Georgie's turn, she tested him in the same way, and after he had done his best, she played another short tune and asked him to try again. She did that a third time, and just when he was sure that he had failed, she turned and placed her hand on his shoulder. "You were born with a musical gift, Georgie. You have what we call perfect pitch." She looked pleased. "Come in for practice with Tim. You two will fit in very well with the older boys." The hours of choir practice were joyful ones for Georgie. It was a proud moment when he and the other new additions to the choir had learned a chorale well enough to sing the next day with the older boys. "My voice helped make the singing beautiful," he told his rosebush after the first session with the entire choir. "Sister says our trebles are first rate. She is proud of us." It rained intermittently for several days during the week Sister Mary Angela prepared to have her newly organized choir sing in the chapel on Friday evening. Timothy and Georgie were walking back to their rooms from the playground on the gloomy afternoon before their first appearance as choir boys, when they saw Molly Harper walking slowly in her garden with Robin at her side. Her face looked tired and sad, Georgie noticed, and for a few seconds he felt sorry for her. Timothy waved his hand and called out a cheerful greeting to her. Molly looked over at them and smiled tiredly. "Hello, boys. What has happened to our sunlight lately?" Timothy stepped up to the street curb, eager to talk to her. Georgie held back, his eyes fixed on the ground. He knew what old Eddie would have said if he had been there. "You're acting like a loony, young man, but—" Loony or not, he couldn't bring himself to talk as Timothy did. "We're singing a Bach chorale at Vespers tonight, Mrs. Harper," Timothy told her. "I'm not sure if you know that Georgie and me are in the choir now. Why don't you bring Robin and come over to hear us?" She came up to the fence and laid her hands on the pickets. "Yes, Timothy, Father heard you boys practicing the other day. He told me that I should come over and hear you." She could not tell them that after her father's urging she had said to Rosita, "I don't think I'm quite healed enough to hear 9-year-old voices singing a Bach chorale." "Well, then, why don't you make us a visit?" Timothy urged. "Sister is real glad to have people come in to hear our music." Molly looked down at Robin and fondled his hand. "Would you like to go over to Georgie's school with Mother and hear the boys sing?" she asked. And when Robin's face showed his delight, she turned again to Timothy. "Robin thinks the school belongs exclusively to Georgie," she said. Then she added, "Thank you for the invitation, Timothy. I'll think about it." "She'll be over, I'm pretty sure," Timothy said as he and Georgie walked on together. When they say, "I'll think about it," they mean yes. Anyway, she looks awful lonesome. Georgie felt a sadness inside him. He knew what it meant to be lonesome, and he thought it must be very sad to have Paul and his father dead. He knew, too, however, that he could never forget the morning Mrs. Harper screamed at him, threatening his rosebush, or the wild, mean dreams he'd had of her when his fever was high. He felt as if 2 Georgies were fighting inside him, one pushing in a certain direction, the other quickly pushing back in the other. His heart pounded that evening as he pulled his choir robe on and then stood before Sister Mary Angela, who adjusted the white collar and brushed his hair smoothly across his forehead before going down the road to perform the same service for each boy. "She will hear me sing. Maybe she will know my voice is helping to make it beautiful." He tried hard to remember that he didn't care whether she heard him or not, that her thinking he was good meant nothing at all to him. The chill outside made the chapel seem warm and friendly that evening. There were lighted candles on the organ, and when Mrs. Harper came in, she brought a great basket of late flowers from her garden, which Sister Dolores accepted and placed at the feet of the choir boys in the front row. They filled the organ loft with fragrance. Mrs. Harper looked very beautiful as she sat with Robin near the front of the chapel. Her long braids were twisted into a crown around her head as if for a very special occasion, and she wore a soft-looking dress of blue silk with gold flowers on her high collar. Georgie had never seen her except in the careless work clothes she wore in the garden. "She dressed up nice for us," he thought, and caught his breath as he looked at her. Then he fixed his eyes upon Sister Mary Angela and kept his thoughts on the chorale the choir was going to sing. Every boy sat unmoving and watchful until, at a sign from Sister Mary Angela, they rose, faces alert, eyes never moving from her. The organ whispered a low command, and they sang, sweetly and beautifully, obeying Sister's every direction. At first, the voices were soft and quietly reverent. Then they swelled with power as the tones of the organ swelled. The chorale became so strong and rich that Georgie felt his Rose must be hearing it over in the garden. Finally, the voices and the organ grew softer and softer until there was only a breath of music at the end. When the choir had allowed the last note to fade away, Georgie stole a glance at Mrs. Harper. She was crying. When the brief service was over, the choir boys filed out of the side door from the organ loft and stood in a small room off the foyer until the student body had marched out into the front hall. Sister Mary Angela stood with them, and when she saw Mrs. Harper approaching, she hurried toward her with outstretched hands. "It was good of you to come over this evening, Mrs. Harper. Do come in and say a word to my choir boys. They are very pleased that you came over to hear them sing." "I came to thank them, sister. Their singing was beautiful, very close to being magnificent. It made me cry, but I feel better for having heard them." The boys were crowding around her, proud of their accomplishment, ready to bask in her praise. Georgie stood in the background, allowing himself to be hidden by the older boys in the crowded room. Once he ventured near enough that he could have touched her dress, but he would not say one word to attract her attention. He patted Robin's head briefly, and the child prattled in an attempt to say his name. But Georgie could not talk to Robin there, and so he withdrew to the farthest point in the room and tried not to wonder if she had recognized him in his handsome robe, if she had heard his voice with something called a perfect pitch blending in with the others. A few days later, Sister Mary Angela called all of the 8- and 9-year-old boys into her office for a special announcement. "How would you like to study dramatics and perhaps give a play later on before the student body?" she asked. There was a wild and enthusiastic response. Georgie was excited and delighted at the prospect. He had gone with Sister Mary Angela and a dozen other boys earlier in the fall to see a production of Pinocchio at the Children's Theater in a neighboring town. He had sat, hardly breathing, as he watched children no older than himself perform a storybook miracle on the stage. He had dreamed about that vivid first experience for weeks afterward. "A lot of work is involved," Sister Mary Angela was saying. "Classes will have to be held after school hours, and that will mean you may have to give up other activities that you enjoy if you enter the dramatics class. It won't be altogether a lark. There will be hard work and some sacrifices to be made." "Are you going to teach us, sister?" Timothy asked curiously, as a small suspicion began to grow in his mind. "No, Tim. Mrs. Harper will teach the new class. And for this first term, she wants to work with boys your age. I think you may probably know why." "Paul?" Timothy asked quickly. "Yes, because of Paul," Sister Mary Angela answered. She stopped for a minute and seemed to be thinking. Then she said, "When Mrs. Harper heard the boys' choir the other night, she began to wonder if maybe it would make her feel better if she could work with boys who were Paul's age. She didn't know at first what kind of work she could do, but when we talked it over, we thought that since she is an actress, she might teach you boys how to act out stories, maybe put on a play for the older boys." There was enthusiastic yelling at Sister Mary Angela's words. Georgie didn't yell. He knew that Sister Mary Angela was looking at him, but he wouldn't look back at her. "Of course you can do as you please about taking the class," Sister Mary Angela said. "Some of you may be more interested in other things. Some of you may not care about acting, but would like to build sets or paint scenery. There are so many things to be done beside acting when we put on a play, and we want this to be a pleasant experience for everybody." Then she told the boys that Mr. Collier would be writing dramatized versions of scenes from various books for their class. He is coming over every day for the next week or so and will read to you so that you'll be familiar with the stories you are acting out. He will read parts of Treasure Island, of Tom Sawyer, several scenes from Alice in Wonderland, maybe some poems which he thinks would be fun for you to dramatize. Mrs. Harper mentioned The King's Breakfast, which Paul used to like so much. Georgie sat in on the reading sessions. Boys crowded so close to Mr. Collier that his head was only a spot of silver among the black and brown, red and blond heads around him. His voice was lively, often full of laughter or ominous with predictions of disaster as he read the great old stories to them. When Georgie listened to Tom Sawyer slyly luring the boys into whitewashing the fence for Aunt Polly, or to the bloody pirates talking while Jim Hawkins listened as he lay crouched in the apple barrel, he was half sick with the longing to join Mrs. Harper's class. He had not yet read Alice in Wonderland, but as the White Rabbit, the Duchess, the Hatter, and Alice, as well as dozens of others, became real and living characters, Georgie could hardly stay with his decision never to be friendly with Mrs. Harper. I wish she hadn't been mean, he thought to himself. I wish she hadn't pulled up my rose bush or said the things she did. I wish I didn't have to keep her for my enemy. Once Sister Mary Angela spoke to him privately about the dramatics class. You sing so well, Georgie, and you enjoy singing, don't you? Yes, ma'am. I like to sing, if you're the one that teaches us. Now that you know you can do things well, you've learned to read and to sing, don't you think it would be fun to be in a play? Mrs. Harper has told me that she'd be happy to have you in her class. There was the same sullen shake of his head when Mrs. Harper's name was mentioned. Sister Mary Angela's face took on a look of tiredness as she watched him turn away from her. The tire is still spinning in the icy rut, isn't it, Georgie? Still cutting deeper and deeper and getting positively nowhere. Later he sat beside his rose bush and sulked. Never, never, never was all he could manage to say. Then, remembering the crowd of boys in the auditorium yelling with delight at being accepted into the class, he added, "Bunch of dumb idiots," and told himself that he had better things to do than act in a play.